Cinematologists podcast. Long way back. In this episode, Neil talks to Brett and Simon Harvey of O Region about their third feature film, Long Way Back, which was recently released on streaming platforms following a successful UK cinema tour in late 2022. The conversation covers their career to date, their filmmaking process, their influences, and how they make their work in the challenging conditions of Cornish and UK independent film culture. Elsewhere, Neil and Dario talk about recent films they've seen, including The Caretakers for an upcoming episode, and the recent Chilean release, The Cow Who Sang a Song into the Future. In response to the interview, they talk about ambition in independent film, some of the challenges facing exhibition, what makes regional cinema, and also Neil sets the record straight about his relationship to Damien Chazelle's Whiplash. On with the show. Welcome to the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me down the line, I'm delighted to say, is Dario Linares. Hello, Dario.
Hey, Neil. How are you? You doing well?
I'm doing okay. Yeah, I'm hanging in there. Easter's on the horizon.
It is.
It looks like at the same time we're moving into our new house, which
Nice.
is exciting. So yeah, it's a nightmare, but there's an end in sight. What about you?
Yeah. I'm kind of like waiting for Easter, big style. It was nice to walk home. I just thought I came home in lieu of doing this podcast because I needed to kind of clear my head. I was going to tape in the office, but I was just like, no, I need to get out of there. And it was just a really nice sort of light sky. The first time I've sort of walked home with the sun out. You know, it's usually been dark or pissing it down or both. So it's just nice to feel like, yeah, there may be a little bit of spring in the air, and yeah, generally just very, very busy. So it's nice to talk to you and talk films and not have that kind of in your mind for an hour or so.
Absolutely. We've had the weather check there, which is good. Glad that the weather's okay. And yeah, let's talk about some films. We've got a nice interview in the middle, but before we get to that, let's sort of cover some stuff that we've been watching, because you've seen something recently that is a handy trail for an upcoming episode.
Yeah, so I'm currently working on this episode called Demons of the Mind, and it's a collaboration with a couple of guys who've done a project on the relationship between cinema and psychoanalysis, but not, I mean, obviously there's a massive connection between cinema and psychoanalysis, but it's an understudied area within that, which is not focused on what films mean psychoanalytically. So in the sort of psychoanalytic film theory vein, it's not around that. It's actually about industrial collaborations between the discipline of psychoanalysis, or what they call the sciences, and films and filmmakers and film studios, particularly in the post-war period. And it's just been really nice to think about how to shape that episode. And I've kind of hinged it on, it's going to be an audio documentary more than just an interview. So I taped a long interview with them. But what I'm doing is writing a narrative, writing a kind of script, documentary narrative in that sense, to string all of their quotes together, but then interrelate them with clips from some of the films that they mentioned. So it's been really interesting to go back to the sort of 50s and 60s and look at these sort of problem films or social conscious films around both the psychiatric profession, but then how they deal with, institutions and with patients in various different ways. And probably there's so many examples of that in contemporary films. I mean, I suppose One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is one of the most obvious ones, and you can think of something like Girl Interrupted. I mean, both of those are not new films, of course, but there are newer examples of that, but they're two of the most well-known ones in sort of Hollywood, more contemporary history. But it's interesting how so many tropes of those films you can find in these earlier ones. And I just watched one the other day, which is going to feature, called The Caretakers, which is directed by a guy called Hal Bartlett and stars Robert Stack as one of these kind of goodly psychiatrists. Because I think in the sort of 40s and 50s, there were sort of tropes of the psychiatrist being a kind of mad scientist type, to drive the narrative in this sense. And this is a real clear thematic construction of this character of a psychiatrist who is trying to use his new way of doing psychiatry, his sort of new research, to make patients' lives and experiences better, and coming up against the system, which in this case was a head nurse, very much in the vein of Nurse Ratched, but played by Joan Crawford. And just a really interesting example of the way that a sociological film has been produced with a real sense of it has a purpose behind it. And in terms of the making of the film, there was this collaboration between a psychiatric professional who acted as a consultant on the film, and how that finds its way into the depictions of both the institution and the characters involved. So really looking forward to kind of finishing that and putting it out there. I'm hoping it's going to be the next one. It might be a few weeks to get that done because it's quite a heavy edit. But really interested to see what you make of it, Neil, and the audience when it goes out.
Yeah, really excited to hear what you've been up to, and take that and get that out into the world, and see some of the films as well mentioned. I remember the list coming through originally, and kind of some really interesting titles on there. So that sounds great. Not really a future episode, but one we hope to do is on Chilean cinema at some point, because we're both big lovers of it. And there's a new Chilean film out this Friday called The Cow Who Sang a Song into the Future, which I was sent a screener of. Yeah, what a title.
Wow.
Still don't really know.
What a title that is.
Yeah, still don't really know what the title refers to. There are cows in it. Okay. It's a...
Do they look to the future is the question.
They're looking, but I couldn't tell where.
Okay.
Mostly at the river. Yeah, it's a eco magic realist film, and it's a really wonderful film. It's about a woman played by Mia Maestro, who I know from a TV show called The Strain, but she's sort of been in Hannibal and various bits and pieces. And she plays a woman who has...
Okay.
It's kind of suggested sort of killed herself, and she comes back sort of 10 years later to her sort of husband's farm, and her estranged daughter is brought back when the husband sort of sees his dead wife and has a heart attack. This is very early; it's not really a spoiler. And then the family is reunited, and it's about a dysfunctional family kind of being sort of mended, or sort of healed, I suppose, by sort of the return of the matriarch, who's a very troubled and complex character, as suggested by the fact that she's killed herself sort of 10 years earlier. And alongside that, there's this kind of fable about the planet, particularly around rivers and pollution, and the family they run this kind of farm, and a lot of the tension in the family is about changing the way they do things for the planet and for the sustainability. And
sure,
it's a really quiet film. It's got some really interesting characters, really interesting trans character. It's the sort of the grandson who has a really interesting relationship with his grandmother who he's never met, and it just plays out really beautifully. And it reminded me of one of my favorite Chilean directors in part, which was Raul Ruiz. It's a very poetic film.
Right.
It's very quiet. It's very interested in, just navigating these difficult situations. And what's really, there's lots of things that are really nice about it. One of them is that it's not in Santiago, so it's in kind of rural southern Chile. So it's a kind of Chile that doesn't get shown on screen very often. And it's being released, I think, around World Water Day. There's sort of special screenings around the country in cinemas to kind of highlight some of the issues in the film. One of the great things about it is that the patriarch, the father, is played by Alfredo Castro, who, for fans of Pablo Larraín, will know he was Tony Manero.
Indeed.
And
one of my favourite actors.
Yeah, he's just, he's absolutely fabulous. And it is, it's a film that I think with a lot of magic realist and, ecosophical films, they can sometimes get sort of weighed down by, the quirkiness or the messaging, but because the performances are so good, particularly the relationship between sort of Castro and Maestro, and the daughter played by Leonor Varela, like it just really, really works as a drama, and the performances are fab. So it sort of has a lot of classic tropes, man versus nature, the reluctant homecoming, disconnection from the natural world, but they don't feel sort of too heavy-handed. It's a really lovely film. So that's out in cinemas on Friday with sort of special Q&A screenings around World War today. Well worth checking out.
Sure, yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things I think to come out of Berlin was how many films that you could place broadly in this category of eco-cinema. And I think it definitely, if we do a Chilean cinema episode, I'm always up for that. But something on what eco-cinema is and getting somebody in to sort of talk about that, I think would be a good idea. Because I think that we've got almost sort of seemed to have gone past this idea of we need to make documentaries that point out climate change, because that clearly hasn't worked in a political sense at all. Everybody knows. I mean, there was an article at The Guardian just this morning. It's like, this is your last warning, and I don't want to go down this road, but me and you have talked an awful lot about the sort of the notion of the future and how that defines what decisions you make right now in terms of your own lives and stuff. But I think that this sense of almost a more philosophical, a more, whether it's poetic realist, but a more sort of reflective sense of the relationship to nature, I think is where filmmakers are starting to go, because it seems like on a hiding to nothing, just pointing out that, we're warming and the seas are warming and there's ecological disasters of every different type you can imagine all over the place. And where are we getting with that? I don't know,
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I mean, this was at Berlin last year and Sundance, right. Places where a lot of these films are sort of popping up on the festival circuit. And I think it's a film that tries to look at what's possible on a local level, at the level of family, at the level of generational difference, and sort of almost taking the polar opposite approach of, rather than throwing out into the world and saying corporations have to change, it's saying, well, that doesn't work, so how can we approach this? And of course the drama and the tragedy and the tension comes out of the fact that there's so many different viewpoints on how to approach these things within families, so there is a hope in it, but it's also it's not a naive hope. It has lots of moments where the task of actually convincing older generations, or even people across various ideological lines, to join forces is laid bare, which I think is makes it quite resonant.
For sure. So maybe let's get on to the main portion of the episode. So this is an interview that you put together on a film that has an association with your film lab down there in your personal film lab that you've got down in Cornwall. Yeah,
my own little bespoke film production arm. Don't be fooled. I don't actually think that, listeners. But no, it is a Sound Image Cinema Lab production or co-production with O Region. So we had an episode on Wilderness, which was the film that I wrote and produced way back, and was released in 2021, which is when we did our episode on it. And I've sort of conducted an interview with Brett Harvey and Simon Harvey from O Region, who made what was the second film in the kind of filmmaker in residence program through the lab. So this was a project which we supported and funded through the lab and the university here, in the same model as Wilderness. So kind of supporting a feature film's production with a sort of predominantly student crew, shot here in Cornwall, and it was shot in 20 2019, and then released in cinemas late last year, and then released digitally. Now it's available to rent now, as of the last couple of weeks. So I wanted to sort of talk to Simon, Brett as people who are kind of very active in the Cornish film industry and community about their film and their filmmaking. And yeah, we had a nice in-person conversation, which was really nice, because obviously a lot of the stuff we do now by necessity is remote. So it was nice to be in a room and just having a conversation, and hopefully people see that we just had a conversation. I've talked to them a lot about this stuff and wanted to try and approach it rather than Q&A, just a sort of conversation about what they do and about this film in particular. So yeah, that was a nice morning.
Great, yeah, and it was just nice to hear those guys, because obviously I know them from working down in Falmouth, and some really interesting stuff that comes out of the conversation that you have, that just, it made me reflect on my time in Cornwall, and at times I don't think I made the most of that, if I'm being honest. It was one of those things where it was my first academic job, so I just felt like I wasn't in a position to be able to sort of dictate what I could and couldn't do, especially early on. Later on, I sort of had more of a managerial role, but it was interesting to say there was a little bit of subtext about how, Cornwall's great, but also it's got its problems in terms of a filmmaking community. So maybe we can sort of name some of those things that they didn't, or at least sort of go a little bit deeper into that now that I'm out of the picture and it doesn't really matter. But yeah, it was a great interview. So thanks for putting it together.
Absolute pleasure. So let's get to that now. This is me talking with the writer-director Brett Harvey and the producer Simon Harvey about their film Long Way Back.
This is going to be a very long trip if we don't talk to each other. Okay. We'll just do this then.
You got any kids?
Daughter,
How old?
19.
Does it get any easier?
No, it just gets more and more complicated. I don't know what to do.
Just keep going. That's all any of us can do.
How much longer is this going to go on? This whole faux rock star living in oblivion bullshit. Who are you? Are you going to be okay, Dad?
I don't know.
So, hello.
Hello.
I'm here with Brett and Si from O Region, the team behind Long Way Back.
Thank you for having us.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Do you need us to say our names before each one of us speaks? Because we do sound quite similar.
No need, Brett. That was really lovely. So hopefully that's enough. Yeah, it's really lovely to see you at what is not really the end of the journey. Yet another stage in a very long journey. So the film has just come out on streaming.
Yeah.
So yeah, how are you feeling about it?
It's sort of bittersweet, I suppose, because it's not the end, but it feels like a significant milestone. So we've still got screenings and we'll be doing Q&As and things like that, but it sort of feels like it does feel like an ending of sorts, I suppose. You're giving it out on a wide platform. And, I've been living with the film for so long that it feels sort of strange to not have it in my life anymore. Even though it is still in my life technically.
Yeah. And you felt that it was in your life right up until whatever the computer presses send.
Yeah, well, you're always sort of heading towards the next. This was always sort of like the big target. I suppose this is the biggest release it will get.
Mm.
So now that all your energy focuses in on the date it gets released, and then it gets released, and you go, oh, I guess that's kind of it now. I'm handing it over to the world.
I suppose the next. So we're in between. So it came out a week ago to purchase online, and then next Monday it comes out for rental. So that's the one that I'm hoping we can push a little bit in terms of that. Loads of people were asking when we did the cinema release, and obviously we were hamstrung by how many cinemas we got it to. So we went out to about 28 cinemas across the UK. But we had friends from abroad who've seen it on social media, or friends we didn't get a screening in London, unfortunately. So lots of people saying, where can we see it? Where can we see it? So it'd be really nice to get it out to those guys. And then, like Brett said, we've got a few more. We're now not doing cinemas, but we're doing an open air screening in the summer down in Penlee in Penzance, and we're putting it out to the film clubs, and of which there's quite a few around Cornwall, so we're going to be doing that. So we'll still be getting it out to audiences in that respect, but it kind of feels like it's going to look after itself now, and it means we can pretty much shift our emphasis onto whatever the next one is.
Yeah, which I did want to kind of come back to, not in specifics, but in terms of direction. So you sort of mentioned there the tour that you did and the film clubs. That's your model, isn't it? Like you're kind of comfortable with that. So how has it felt with this new edition? Because I guess you've done really well with the films in terms of like DVD release, particularly for Brown Willie. But does it feel like, this is something new in terms of like an unknown that you haven't encountered before? Because a lot of that activity in terms of the touring and the film clubs is places that you're very familiar with.
Do you mean in terms of the online release, or just
the online release? Yeah. Well, I want to talk specifically about the cinema release in a bit, but just this new online. It's out there in a way that maybe your films haven't been in the past.
It's the first time we've managed to get it onto so many platforms, and that's been working with Pat Kelman at 606 Distribution. So he's got a lot of those connections, so he's been helping us to do that. So we did an online release with Brown Willie, but it was very much on our own steam, and we put it out through just one or two platforms, but we didn't get it onto the big ones really. And Brown Willie's still ticking over, isn't it, bit by bit? We still get the odd rental and a little bit dropping in here and there. But yeah, certainly this is exciting in terms of getting it to a wider audience potentially. In that respect.
Because the other two films were mostly, so Weekend Retreat and Brown Willie were both released on Vimeo, so people can rent or buy on Vimeo digitally. But that's not as many people have access to that platform or are aware of that platform. So it's kind of exciting in this respect to go, it's on loads of platforms now, so it's much more accessible to people.
People don't sort of seem to believe it's released unless it's on iTunes or Amazon, the ones that everyone knows, which it now is, which is great. Yeah,
it does come with a marker, doesn't it? Of like, oh, you've actually made a film now.
It's legitimate.
Which is strange because obviously, I guess for people of our age making films, the legitimacy would be cinemas.
Yeah,
and that's the desire, is that it's seen in that space. So it's interesting that that's almost shifted to digital.
Yeah, we didn't believe that was going to be even we were talking about streaming as far back as Weekend Retreat, which was 11 years ago now, and streaming platforms, and talking to Denzel, and Denzel was obsessed with getting on streamers, but it didn't feel that the shift has definitely happened in the last 10 years, that people now expect that, and that's where most people consume, don't they, is on streaming platforms.
Yeah, but it has been in cinemas, and you did do a tour with it. What was that like, and what was what were the differences around the country, and what were the similarities in terms of the experiences that you encountered?
I mean, it was great. This is the most cinemas we've ever got a film into. I think Brown Willie was on 10 screens, was it?
Yeah, and that's very much southwest based.
Yeah, and this was 28 and was all over the shop.
So it went up as far as Oban in Scotland and Penrith, Lake District, and sort of really Oxford. It sort of went all over the place, which was great. And the difference was, So Brown Willie, we got two screenings in the Watershed in Bristol, whereas this did a full week's run there. So, and in Cornwall it ran for about a month all in.
Yeah.
So it was just much wider than we had previously managed to achieve, which was great. In terms of similarities, it was really the film has a particular pace and energy, and that kind of worked everywhere really. So we did Q&As after loads of the screenings, so Brett and I did lots of sitting around. So we'd do an intro and then we would sit in the cinema. We didn't really watch it at all during that September run. I didn't. And then I was working in Scotland, so I was near Penrith, and I went to Penrith, and I thought, and it was a really gloomy day, so I did the intro, and I thought, I'm just going to watch it and just see. And it was quite nerve-wracking because obviously we didn't know anyone in that cinema. There was about 40 people there on a Sunday afternoon.
Great.
But it was great watching it, and yeah, and it just sort of validated it for me watching it with that audience. And I did a Q&A afterwards there, and it just sort of it has a particular energy, and it sort of works under people's skin a little bit. And then by the end of the film, once people see it in its entirety, it always seemed to, when it touched a nerve with people, it seemed to really touch a nerve with people. And there was a lot of really interesting conversation that came up from it afterwards.
I suppose, just sort of picking up on that, it was interesting. The film has a very, very deliberate pace, and that pace is set in the first 15 minutes. It's slow, and you're not getting all the information from the characters, and the film expects an audience to do the work. And that was always by design, and that's sort of the beauty of making something independently, is you can do that. And it's, to me, I watch the film and think, I can sort of hear the notes I would get if this had been funded traditionally. And the notes would all be around sort of going, an audience won't have the patience, an audience won't do the work. And it was just that amazing thing of going to screenings and going, no, audiences do have the patience, they will do the work.
Yeah.
They are way more interested in meeting a film on its own terms. And I think that there's a lot of it feels like people don't have faith in audiences anymore. And actually, the thing that we learned from the screenings, and especially from the Q&As, is you should have faith in your audience. You can trust an audience to go with the film.
I mean, there's some really fascinating, because the film is, Brett said it doesn't give answers early, it doesn't give all the information early, and arguably it doesn't give all the information through the whole film either, so it sort of leaves a lot of space for people to interpret stuff. And again, by design, and the script, as you all remember probably from reading it, did answer a lot more, and through the making of it and the editing of it, bits got taken out deliberately. But it was sort of, really fascinating how, and some of the theories that people came up with and some of the readings of it were really interesting, and not necessarily what I think I thought or we thought, but equally valid. It was great.
It must have been gratifying to be in the cinemas with that kind of response, given a frustrating festival run, where I think what you're saying there, Brett, is what I sort of see at festivals now, where before that was the space where audience would be trusted and films would be trusted, whereas now it feels like almost festivals are thinking our audiences won't come to this. So they've almost shifted, particularly independent festivals, from more interesting, daring work into something much safer, whereas that doesn't feel like it's their job. They've almost assumed what cinema audiences will do, but as the tour has shown, that's just not the case.
Well, it was sort of interesting with festivals. I mean, we were slightly victims of circumstance, because we were trying to get the film into festivals during probably the most oversubscribed year in film festival history. Because of the pandemic, people were holding their films back, so we were trying to get it into festivals at a time where everyone was trying to get their films screened. It was disappointing. There was one festival that I thought we were going to get into, I won't name them, and their response was they were only interested in films that were optimistic and happy because of the post-pandemic world. And that kind of stung a bit, because you go, well, I don't think the film is happy, but I think the film ends on a note of optimism to me. So
depending on how you read it, but
and that was disappointing, because you go, like you say, film festivals are the place to be challenged by a film, You don't know much about what you're going to see. So that was a little disappointing, but then the tour kind of was joyous in that respect, so swings and roundabouts.
Yeah. Fantastic. So it's the third film, or third feature, I should say.
Yeah.
And it is very different. And I wonder, we'll talk about sort of where you are now, but like, is it something that the kind of film you always wanted to make? Is it a kind of, would you think it'll be an outlier, or is it a kind of change of direction? You know, where does it sit in your kind of, in your sort of your career, but also where you want to go as filmmakers?
I think after we made Brown Willie, broadly speaking, is a comedy. It's a comedy drama, but it's sort of comedy first, I would say. And I really enjoyed screenings of that, and Weekend Retreat was comedic, sort of a comedy thriller, but comedy first as well. And I sort of felt like after Brown Willie, it was like, oh, okay, we know how to make an audience laugh. And I remember thinking it'd be interesting to try to get right out of my comfort zone and do something that isn't comedy first. But to me, they're quite similar because there is a thread of drama running throughout Brown Willie. There's more to it than the laughs. So it just, in my head, it was switching those two things around and going drama first. So there are sort of lightly comedic moments in Long Way Back, but yeah, it was born out of a desire to sort of challenge myself, to sort of go, to step into a sort of more difficult place. And the thing is if you get funding to make a film, that opens up such a world of opportunities, like, because you have money, so you have time, so you can do things. But also what comes with that is you have to answer to a lot more people. And when we made Brown Willie, Si and I funded it ourselves. So the only person I had to answer to was Si, and the only person Si had to answer to was me. And the freedom that came with that was really interesting. And I sort of took that mentality into Long Way Back and was like, I might not ever get a chance to make a film that could be this challenging or could go to this sort of place. And that's why we're really lucky with the Sound Image Cinema Lab here at Falmouth University, because there was basically no sort of strings attached. It was more just encouragement. Make the thing you want to make is what was said to us. So
yeah, and I think we made Brown Willie specifically as an experiment in a way, but we knew we wanted to make something comedic and light because we knew we were putting it straight into cinemas originally with no other plan than to do 1 week in one cinema in Truro to see if we could make our money back, and so that was the only pressure we put on ourselves. And so the style of the film and the way we marketed the film was all based around that, and then that grew and it became bigger than that, and it released on more screens and ran for longer. But it was an easier sell for that, and we weren't bothered about putting it into festivals or anything. Whereas with this, we had like Brett said, the Sound Image Cinema Lab put some money in, and we had a bigger budget than we've had previously to work with. Still very small in filmmaking terms, but bigger. And that allowed us to take a few more risks and to take our time with it, and we certainly have done that. It's been quite a long process in that respect. But like Brett said, it was let's see how we can push the aesthetic of this more. Let's just on a purely brass tacks level, Brown Willie was all exterior locations, just 2 actors. This had more like 12 actors, 23 locations over 21 days. It was pushing as much as we could into that budget, and lots of stuff in a moving vehicle. And so from a production point of view, we wanted to push it much further. And I think we've certainly achieved that. Aesthetically, it's stronger than anything we've made before. The sound is better. We were able to get music commissioned for it specifically, which we've not been able to do since Weekend Retreat. We were able to get a couple of well-known tracks which were important to the story. So in terms of production values, we wanted to really up that on this. And like Brett said, narratively, it was a chance to do something and push ourselves in that respect.
I think in terms of like career and where it will sit, to me the sort of perfect filmography is someone like Richard Linklater, who can sort of pivot and chop and change, and that there's a weird consistency in the inconsistency of what he makes. He just makes something different each time. And I kind of love that. I sort of fear being boxed in too much. You don't want people to get what they're expecting from what you're making next.
Yeah.
I suppose. So I kind of like that. It felt good after Brown Willie to do such a left turn with this one, and then hopefully with the next one it will kind of be another swerve, a bit of a pivot into something different again.
Interesting you mentioned Linklater, because, when I think of him, when I think of Austin, and I think of this place where there is a film community, where there is there is an independent film scene that is, outward facing in terms of the work it makes and its aspirations, but also, like a real community looking after itself. And that's certainly what I've found since moving here, is that, there is a film community. Cornish cinema is talked about a lot at the moment. We know why. Hello, Mark. But the reality on the ground is that this is a place where people make a lot of work and they support each other's work. It really feels like, and you two pop up all the time, producing, executive producing, editing, and and what's been so nice being here nearly 10 years is that's just how it seems to be. Is that your experience of it? And also, how has that enabled you to kind of make this kind of work, which is, I think Long Way Back is a very daring film, and you can see through that filmography it's grown. How much do you feel part of a community here, and how much does that community kind of feed into your work?
Let you answer that.
And I know it's going to be political for sure, but
Well, I always think of... so I was really lucky. I made films for Knee High, the theatre company that recently sort of ended. And I once had to interview Mike Shepherd, who was the founding member of the company. And he was talking about where Knee High came from. And he said that he was working in London and as an actor, and he just wanted to come home to Cornwall because Cornwall was a place, quote, where you could get stuff made. And I always remember hearing that and thinking, oh yeah, I've never thought about it in those terms. And I think in terms of the sort of community, filmmaking community, that's true. It sort of is a place where you can get stuff made, and there seems to be a sort of mentality. I'm sure this is the same in other places, but in Cornwall there's this mentality of people, you just make it, just try it, just make it. So I do feel part of a filmmaking community down here. I also think we're really lucky because there's lots of very talented people here making really interesting work, and there's new filmmakers popping up all the time. And I feel very well supported, and as an extension of that, I feel sort of duty bound to support people if they're asking for help. I really like that. I really, enjoy that. So I worked as an editor on Ed Rowe's first short film last year. And that was really fun, coming in just as an editor and just helping him sort of shape the story. And I'm doing a little bit of edit work on Laura Canning's new short film, Day After Tomorrow, actually. And again, I really like that because the more you sort of help other people, the more you kind of learn for yourself. So we're just really lucky in Cornwall. There's lots of great people around making interesting work. I feel very lucky to be part of it.
Yeah, there's lots of places
How
with
did
great
I
people
do?
making it. Is that good? Is that
It's all right. Yeah, it's not bad.
Well, there's there's lots of people making great. There's lots of great people making interesting work, but not many places feel as supportive as here. Which just in terms of going out and seeing stuff and just having each other's backs. But I do think that feeds into the work that you make, which feels, as an outsider coming in, as I have been, independent filmmaking in the kind of the best sense, like rooted in a place that is felt, even if the stories are like Long Way Back, not quote unquote a Cornish story.
Yeah,
which I think is interesting.
I think it was important to us with. So it was one of the things we talked about a lot with Long Way Back, is that we, like you say, the story takes place across the UK, and it's a journey of a father and daughter coming back to Cornwall, having the daughter having left university in mysterious, tragic circumstances, but we wanted it to be as Cornish as we could in that respect. Partly practical, so we didn't have the budget to do the journey that they do within the film, so we had to find ways of doing that. So that's part of the challenge, was finding locations that could double and working out how to shoot all the road stuff. So very, very little of it is shot outside of Cornwall, but equally when we were casting it, we wanted it to be as Cornish as we could get it. So Tristan and Chloe, the two leads, are both actors that we know from theatre, and that, going back to Brett's previous comment, has been quite a lot, you know, our knowledge of the theatre scene and our immersement in that theatre scene and the film scene to us is very, very blurry in terms of pulling stuff together. But then we were thinking about who could play the foster mother, and then we hit upon Susan Penhaligon, who's quite a renowned actress from Cornwall originally and desperate to be back here. And so we reached out to her. She'd seen a theatre show that I'd directed, and we made the link through Ed Rowe. Ed Rowe in the film. So all of the subsidiary cast, all the supporting cast was as Cornish as we could make it. All the 80%, 85% of the locations are all in Cornwall. So that's important to us. And going back to that previous point, I think you're sort of partly you're forced to do it that way. If you're going to be here and you're going to be 5 hours away from London, or the nearest higher place is Bristol or whatever, you know, you have to work around that. So geographically it forces that, and also there's just the way that we've worked for the last 20 years now and working with other projects. It's sort of all built up to this point, really.
I suppose the beauty of it is there isn't a lot of money or sort of funding in Cornwall necessarily, but then you have things that are sort of production assets or production values that you can't really put a price on. So we know if we make a film and we're in the edit, there's like 10 people we can send the edit to who are filmmakers in Cornwall that are brilliant, that can look at it. If you're writing a script, you know, there's so many people around that you can send a script to get really good sort of writing feedback on. And it's kind of using that and paying that forward as well, and being happy to sort of return the favour to other filmmakers, which we are, which I feel very proud of. I'm sort of very lucky to be a part of it, I think.
Cool. I wanted to just go back a bit in terms of the challenges you set yourself with the film, because you mentioned the aesthetic challenges, you mentioned the kind of the tonal challenges. The film was shot before lockdowns, but then edited throughout that period. And it came out the other side with as you kind of alluded to, this very specific, determined pace, which I think, you know, absolutely serves the film beautifully. And I just wonder what it was like to sit with that over that period of time, because I wonder if there were any moments where you were tempted to take the sort of the industry notes that might have been bubbling around because of, you know, just the sheer strangeness of that period, and I'm wondering, like, what kind of world is the film going to go into?
I will answer the question, but in a roundabout way.
No, it's fine.
What's fascinating to me about any sort of film or creative project is it sort of starts with one person in a room going, I think this is a good idea, and then 5 years later you watch it with an audience and go, was this a good idea? Yeah, I think this was a good idea. And so much of it becomes I think the trick is not to second guess yourself too much in the edit. I think it's always good to kind of be questioning stuff, but you've got to keep it within a certain sort of limit. So in terms of the pace, I was never tempted to sort of speed it up. Because it just felt right, and I find that when all else fails, go with your instincts in that point. And certainly we were screening it to people, trusted people like yourself, to sort of watch it, and we never got any feedback to say it was too slow or anything like that. It always felt right for the project. But the thing you worry about is you're always aware of an audience. How will an audience take this? And it goes back to what we were talking about having faith in an audience, of going, no, I think people will go with it. I think as long as you set the pace in that opening act of the film, stay true to that, you're not going to surprise them later on in the film. You're kind of setting your stall out and hoping that they'll go with it.
Just in terms of the edit, though, if you think about the timeline of it, we pretty much, you'd done a full cut of it, and so we were just 2 weeks before the first lockdown. We were in the Plaza Cinema in Truro watching it on a big screen, and really we were looking at the grade and listening to the sound mix, so we were already at picture lock, really.
Yeah.
So weirdly, there wasn't masses of post going on during the lockdown, because we literally had probably 5% left of the film to do. We were sort of patting ourselves on the back going, this is great, we've done this so quickly, isn't it brilliant what fun we can do, you know, we've turned this around in just under 6 months, because that's what it had been. We shot it in 2019, it was pretty much there early March 2020. We had literally a couple of notes to do, and then obviously the world shut down. So we couldn't get back in here to do the final bit of sound mix, and we couldn't get to Michael's to do the final bit of picture grade. So we were literally sat for that first lockdown, not able to do the work that we needed to do to finish it off. So it was so sort of tantalising. And also you were seeing a lot of stuff being released online during those lockdowns. And in a way, if we'd been just, you know, if things had gone differently and we didn't have 5% left to do in that last, we might have considered putting it into one of those festivals online, and it might have had it definitely would have had a different trajectory. So it was a long-winded process, but we held our nerve with it. I think we didn't feel like we wanted to push it out there at that. We sort of knew what we had, we loved what we had, and we were excited about it, but we held back. And then we got in touch with the festival agency, and they agreed to take it on and help us come up with a festival strategy. And then we held our nerve with that for another year, while it was getting sent off to festivals, getting rejected, you know, possibles but not happening, and all the rest of it. And so we just held on and just thought, it'll be what it will be now. We've come this far, we'll, rather than rush it out or put it into somewhere smaller or whatever, we held on until the Manchester premiere came in. I mean, that was quite a tough process, really, because we would get the feedback and we'd see it's been rejected from another 30 festivals. We probably got rejected from over 100 festivals before we got our first one, and then we got a few more off the back of it. But I think it's safe to say it didn't, partly because Brett was saying everything was coming out post, and there was lots of stuff coming out, and partly I think because we were sending it off to festival programmers, and I'm not sure that they necessarily watch it in its entirety. Always that might be doing a disservice to some of them, but I think if you watch it on a screener link on a small laptop and you're watching and you're waiting to be grabbed in the way a cinema audience will respond to a blockbuster, it is never going to work in that respect. The cinema worked really, really well for us because you've got an uninterrupted viewing of it,
and it slowly sweeps the audience along without them even realising.
And like certainly the feedback we were getting is people saying, "I blindsided me. It did this." It sort of got under my skin. And still talking to people now. A couple of weeks ago, people saying, "I saw the film and it's really stayed with me." And so that's good, and we sort of knew that as well. I think we always talked about saying that this wouldn't necessarily be a film for everyone, but when it touched a nerve, we felt like it would really touch a nerve because of the subject matter and the way that it's dealt with. So
it's almost kind of like worth holding your nerve for that final. Or not final, but that big sort of cinema. This is the idea you had, I guess, at the start in terms of what it could be when you're sitting there on your own thinking, what could it be? It could be that, and to get there must be really rewarding. Yeah,
and it was back to the way it was sort of shot and conceived. It was going, we've come this far, it would be a shame not to release this on big screens. It would be a shame not to get out into cinema. So we just, like Si said, just held our nerve.
Yeah.
But having a picture lock meant that you can't go back in and tinker with it because that's going to cost.
Which is probably a good thing, really.
Yeah. A good place to be shut down. You mentioned that you got a couple of tracks that you were hoping for in the music. I did want to talk about the music, and we've talked about it a lot. But what I did want to ask was like music influences in film, because one of the things I was realising is that what you don't see very often anymore, but you used to see a lot 60s, 70s, is score by X with songs by another artist, which is sometimes works really well and sometimes just really doesn't. Works well here, but you just don't really see it where so I really want to share what I know of that process, but talk a bit more about it, because you are bringing essentially two very different styles, sensibilities, musical people together and trying to make them work in the whole. So, yeah, can you just sort of talk through the process of that, and if there are any instances of films that you like that do that, but also general kind of musical styles you like in movies?
So, the score is by Matthew Thomason and the songs are by Luke Toms. And Luke's an old school friend of mine. We've known each other for years and years and years now. And it was way back when I was writing the script and developing the script that he had written a collection of songs that were to do with a tragedy that had happened in his family. And he basically got in contact with me and said, I'm coming home to Cornwall, I'm going to record this music in my home. I'm probably never going to play these songs live again. So I'm going to record the album with an invited audience. Could you film it? And I was like, yeah, of course. And it was a very intense, intimate gig in his house, and a house that I sort of grew up in myself because we've known each other for so long. And the songs were so personal and so painful but beautiful that I was editing them at the same time as writing the script, and they just sort of bled into each other. I just couldn't get them out of my head when I was developing bits of the script. So I got back in contact with Luke and pitched him the idea of Long Way Back and said that I wanted to use sort of 4 or 5 of his songs in the film. And he was really up for it, and they sort of came in. So that happened at a script level. The score happened in a really sort of weirdly roundabout way. It was before we'd shot. It was when we were sort of lining up to shoot the film. Si was working on a project with Matthew.
And Adam Layton, cinematographer.
DOP, yeah. And whilst they were out filming, whilst Adam was filming, Si and Matt were just chatting, and Matt was like, what are you working on next? And Si pitched him the idea for the film. And Matt went away on his own and just started tinkering around on the piano and sort of came up with some sketches and ideas, and then
there was no conversation that Matt was going to do the score at all.
Yeah.
It was just we pitched him the idea and he was like, oh right, okay, and then we ended up sort of telling him the whole idea.
I think we even sent him the script after he sent the first few.
Not for the first thing. He literally sent. He went away and said, I've been thinking about it, and he sent one track through, and it was Leah's theme.
Oh yes,
a sketch of that. He sent that through and said, look, I don't want to overstep the mark, but and I don't want to expect anything from this, but what do you think of this? This was something I wrote inspired by what you told me about it, which I then sent to Brett, and we were like, wow, this is really good, it's got a really nice feel to it. And then we sent him the script, and then sort of had the conversation about him coming on board and putting a few. I don't think we talked about him doing the full score at that point.
No, he. My recollection of it is he sent through loads of scratch versions of music. My memory is that I responded really positively and went, "This is brilliant." Turns out, in reality, I never sent that email, so he just didn't hear anything from us. But I had all the music with me when we were on set shooting.
So he knew that we were going to use his music, and the agreement was come to that he was going to write it. But, he, in his mind, he was sending us sketches, and we were going to then have a conversation, and then he was going to go off and work them up. Brett just really liked them, so we just started using them, and we had them on set, and we're using them.
Yeah, so I was able to play the music on set at certain points over whilst we were shooting stuff, and then when we got into the edit I used all the scratch recordings, and then we invited Matt round to watch the film.
In Matt's mind, Matt was coming round to have the conversation about what he would then go off and actually start writing. He came and watched the full edit of the film with all his scratch tracks on there. I was like, wow, and we were like, this is great, so we just need these re-recorded. To which he went, great, I've not written any of this down, I haven't scored any of it, they're just sketches. So he then had to relearn
unpick his own
track. And we didn't find this out until doing a Q&A, and Matt came and did one of the Q&As, and he said this, and we were like, oh, we hadn't realised that had been such a nightmare for you.
But having the score, having a version of the score in place before we were filming was so useful.
Yeah.
So I can't really imagine doing it the traditional way of having it scored afterwards.
It was the same on Brown Willie, wasn't it? We had the songs before.
We had the songs before, yeah.
So Matt never heard Luke's songs then?
No,
No.
until he saw the final version
and Luke had written all his songs
way back.
way back
Before,
before
yeah.
the score was written.
So subsequently, they just kind of weirdly blend. They both recorded on old pianos that've got a particular almost slightly out of tune. You know, they're quite broken down pianos. They're both piano-led songs, and so they just sort of bleed together really nicely. They've subsequently met at a premiere in Truro and are talking about it, and both of them are really keen now to
Do a live.
do a live. So we're exploring how to do that, because we think it will be quite, I hesitate to say easy, but all we need is a piano and a microphone. Obviously Luke sings, Matt just plays, and so the two, you know, we think we can do it. We've just got to, when we've got time, we will do that. So
Will
I
they
think
be
it'll
sat
pretty
next to each other
extraordinary.
like a 70s chat show on the piano stool?
That'd be great.
Chatting and just playing together. That'd be like
Well,
multiple minds.
I imagine them like, if we can get two pianos, we'll have them back to back like Billy Joel and Elton John.
The piano men.
The
Lovely.
piano man.
I'm sort of glad that they didn't hear what the other person was doing though, and didn't influence each other in that way. I sort of prefer that.
And Luke has certainly, you know, having gone from I'm never going to play these songs again, has actually been quite cathartic for him.
Yes,
so he's released these tracks now, and he's really up for the idea of playing them live. I think part of it, anyone that hears them, they're so raw, and they were only ever recorded in that one live performance, and so they've got a very particular feel to them because of that. I think the emotion comes right through.
Yeah, and they play, well, all music plays a very specific, important role in the film in terms of where the emotion sits
Yeah.
a lot of the time until kind of everything kind of comes together at the end.
I love songs in films though. I love films that have songs written for them. The thing that I always think about is Cat Stevens and Harold and Maude.
Yeah.
And
That was what I was thinking of this morning.
such an important role that plays in the film. Like, you can't separate the two. And it doesn't happen that often anymore, which is a shame, I think.
No, it's normally just the end credits to get the Oscar nomination, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
you know, so yeah, I mean, I always love it when there's a specific love theme in the film. That's what we did in Wilderness, was like have this love theme sequence, you know, which people are like, well, why are they just? And it's like, well, because you know that's what we want to see. But yeah, those specific pieces of music written specifically for certain things, I think it is so rare. And yeah, that's really interesting to hear that process kind of come together.
And I suppose Luke's songs sort of, I always imagine them almost like the sort of Greek chorus of the film. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's the role they play in the narrative. So I can sort of, the logic of it is that Luke would be an artist that Leah, the daughter character, likes, so she has his songs on the iPod. But then the father character, David, is really into music. He's quite a sort of music aficionado. So he would have heard of Luke. He'd be into sort of Luke's stuff. So the logic of it, how it sits in the story, makes sense, but also the role that those songs play outside of that was sort of carefully thought about as well.
And one of the songs, one of the earliest songs, sort of, you know, but I think you would probably only pick that up on a rewatch.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Have you found that people have gone back and go, oh yeah, that there is almost that kind of Greek chorus narrator at the start, sort of laying out the emotional joke, which I think, you know, I didn't pick up on it the first time, but I think watching it again, I was like, oh, actually, there is a
it's
foreshadowing,
interesting.
shall we say?
The film doesn't have a twist per se. We try not to describe it as a twist, but there's a reveal in the sort of third act that changes your experience of the first two acts. And what's been incredible about screenings and Q&As is people get it at different points in the story. So some people kind of twig quite early on, sort of first 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and other people don't get it until right towards the end. And what's really nice is the film works either way. It doesn't spoil your enjoyment of it, because it's not a twist, it's not a shock twist or anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't sort of spoil your experience of it. What is very useful about that is it means most people want to watch the film again. So you've got a film that people want to watch at least twice, which is quite useful.
Always good.
And I think like you say, I think it's the first of Luke's songs, The Harbour, the very first bit, the very first two lines of the song effectively tell you what happens in the film.
but even yeah, it does that. But there's a passage in one of my favourite bits is early in the film. David literally tells you what he says almost on the nose what the plot of the film is. He sums it up in one monologue early on as well, which is kind of great. But he also sort of tells you more than that. He kind of tells you the theme of the film as well. Of redemption.
That's always a sort of satisfying moment when you're writing, when you get that, when you work out that you can do that quite early on in the film, set out the kind of themes of it and just hide them enough that they're not too obvious. You can take the rest of the day off if you're writing.
Well, I was just going to ask about writing and I guess pre-production, because you both sort of alluded there to the role that music plays. Do you write to music, and have you always gone in? Because you mentioned there about Brown Willie side, which I wasn't aware of. You had the songs before, is music a big driving force in terms of your creative process, in terms of writing and then knowing what the film's going to be?
Yeah, well, yes, it is. I listen to music all the time when I'm writing. I also find that making playlists is a very good bit of procrastination, because you can kid yourself into thinking that you're actually doing some work by putting together a playlist.
We've all been there.
I also put together watch lists as well, like films I should probably watch that are in the same sort of sphere as the thing I'm trying to write. But I've always got music playing, because music's so important in films. I find it really is kind of the driving force, and writing is, as you know, can be so sort of painful and difficult and like getting blood from the stone. So anything that helps that process along, that moves it forward, is useful, certainly.
It's interesting. I guess you are the producer of these films. It feels like for you, music must play a really important role in terms of you understanding what the film is. In a way that's different to reading the script. There's a kind of tonal thing. There's an atmospheric thing in terms of is that how you consciously see it, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly with, Brett is pretty prescriptive of where he puts them in the script. So with Brown Willie, for example, we did a read through here in the cinema, and we had the tracks. And Brett knew where the track was coming in and going out, so he'd sort of taken it to a point so we could literally, as we did the read through, Brett was DJing along to it and putting the music under, so it was under sequences. So that is a really helpful link into it. And it was the same in Long Way Back, so I knew where Luke's songs would sit, and so I could kind of get the tone out of them. But I feel like I know Brett's writing really well, so I can get. So reading it is the key. That's how our process starts early. Is Brett will get a draft out on page and we'll talk it through, and then it will get developed from there. And then I'll suggest things and sort of work in that creative producer kind of role, I guess. But yeah, the music, it's certainly it all helps. But I think given the closeness of our working relationship, then I say personal ones dreadful, working ones all right. I get where he's coming from a lot of the time on that level.
Sometimes it works in different ways as well. Like sometimes with Brown Willie, all the music's by a band called 3 Cane Whale, who are friends of ours. So it was lots of different tracks by 3 Cane Whale, and on Long Way Back, the original sort of playlist was pulling from lots of different directions. On the next film, I've recently stumbled on one piece of music that I think is the thing that helps me get into the right headspace to write it, which I've just cut together the sort of sizzle reel to. So it sort of works differently for each one, but it's like I will never be able to use the piece of music, but it just helps me click into the right sort of state of mind.
The sizzle reel's really helpful as well, I think. You did one for Long Way Back, which we showed here when we launched
I remember
the
that.
project.
Yeah, I remember that.
And actually, if you look back at that now, you kind of go, oh yeah, it's very close to a lot of the stuff. And the one that Brett's just cut for the new one floored me when I saw it a couple of weeks ago, because it so captures it. It's brilliant.
Well, never say never, because you got a paper track in the last one.
That's
true.
Which is
this one would cost significantly more.
Well, I say never say never. So yeah, you sort of alluded to there in terms of like the closest to the relationship. Obviously, brothers working together for a very long time, still working together, unlike Coen brothers.
And the Farrelly brothers as well.
Well, less missed as a duo, I would argue, but maybe get back together, Farrellys. But yeah, so I want to end just on kind of what's next, but framed in terms of the challenges, because I think we talked a lot about what Long Way Back represented in terms of a step along, So don't expect you to talk about everything. I want you to talk about what the thing is, but I'm interested in what are the challenges that you've set yourself for the next one? Because it seems like you achieved so much with this film creatively, and sort of in terms of the release. So have you got any conscious things where you're like, this is what I want to push next time?
I feel like we're both going to say the exact same thing.
Go on then.
Which is the next one would be a significant step up in terms of scale, I would say.
Yeah.
If the next one is the one that we're working on at the moment, it's a much bigger scale. From a sort of personal point of view, from a kind of writer-director point of view, the next one is a step up in terms of genre. It's working in lots of different genres, so it's a step up from a directing point of view of kind of embracing the tropes of those genres and using that. And it's I always sort of, I mean, each film is sort of deeply personal, but the next one is sort of so personal. It's almost sort of hilariously personal. Like, I don't know how I'm going to do Q&As for it. If we do end up making it, I don't think I can get through a Q&A for it because of the subject matter, which I'm happy to talk about now.
Well, it's up to
if
you.
I can get through it now.
Okay, should we do a dry run? I'll be the first.
No, I'm sorry, cut. No, so I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease when I was 37. I'm 41 now.
6 weeks before we shot Long Way Back.
Yes, which is not a good time. Don't think there is a good time, but that's especially not a good time. So and I made a short film called Hand, which was sort of exploring how I felt about it and where I was at. And now I'm kind of off the back of Hand and off the back of Long Way Back. I've written a sort of genre-bending comedy drama about somebody getting Parkinson's disease. Sort of very much coming from the point of view of going, if anyone's allowed to make a comedy about Parkinson's disease, surely it's me. Surely that's the one benefit I can get from being diagnosed. But it's also a film about my love of cinema as well, and why I
in
love
all
sort of
its
filmmaking.
forms.
Yes, yeah.
In high and very, very low brow cinema.
Absolutely.
So the character is someone who sees the world through film, and the films of his youth, the sort of popcorn cinema of his youth. Yeah.
Well, before we came on mic, we were talking about the Oscars.
Yeah.
And that description to me sounds very similar to Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah, it's
not
really,
in terms of like what's driving that story.
It's really strange because I sort of conceived of it before I saw that film, and then had that moment of watching the film of going, yeah, like sort of along these lines. So it's kind of a weird sort of serendipity moment.
We've been working on it a couple of years already, so we actually raised a bit of money. So that it's already a first in that we managed to raise the money, so Brett got paid some time to write this, and we also have worked with a script editor outside of the two of us for the first time in an official capacity, and that was through Screen Growth money through Screen Cornwall. But yeah, so we've been working on it for a while, but weirdly when I saw Everything Everywhere All at Once as well, I was like, this has definitely got vibes that will be similar.
But as going back to the Oscars and going back to the next film, the character in the next film loves sort of highbrow, kind of just loves cinema, which very much reflects my thing.
Yeah.
I think 2012, my two favourite films of 2012 were Holy Motors and The Avengers. And I see just as much value in both of those films. And looking at the Oscars, it was really interesting, having watched Triangle of Sadness recently and then watching Top Gun Maverick and going, I don't see a distinction between, I embrace these films for what they are and on their sort of terms. I just love cinema, I just love films.
Me too, man. Me too. And I love your film.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, I love your work. I love working with you. And it's been really great to chat to you both.
Thanks,
Neil.
very much.
Pleasure.
So yeah, thanks Brett and Si for coming in for a chat. And yeah, Long Way Back is available to rent and buy pretty much anywhere you get your digital film content these days. So Dario, yeah, what did you make of our conversation?
Yeah, really, really interesting. I think my connection to you guys and the region, having worked there for sort of 5 years, but being an outsider, it really sort of touched on some interesting areas. I think just generally as well, though, the idea of what kind of cinema this film and what kind of cinema they're interested in making generally, you know, because you were talking about their wider filmography. And is this a sort of, you know, is this a rural cinema? Is this a regional cinema? And what do those things mean, both in terms of representation, but also in terms of the funding and exhibition models and processes that they have to work within, let's say. I mean, it's interesting because obviously what's happened to Mark Jenkin has kind of shifted the boundaries a touch, because everything's going to be sort of compared to that, which is slightly unfair, I think. You know, I think this film is very much a reflection, I think, of what Si and Brett's interests are in terms of them being Cornish people, but in a very different way to Mark Jenkin, which is interesting considering, you know, you could probably lump them all in together and say, oh, here's Cornish film culturally, but I think they're interested in very different things. And yeah, funnily enough, even though Jenks, I think, goes really deep in on the idea of Cornishness in a sort of, you know, in the ways that he does, which is sometimes quite not fantastical, but, you know, mythic in many ways. Whereas there's a sort of day-to-day reality in this movie that is, you know, set in where it is, but also kind of just a story that people will recognise.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And I think, yeah, and I think that that sort of question of how they release and what they're interested in terms of building an audience, and, you know, whether there is really any intention to sort of think, oh, would this kind of thing play in London? I mean, it was an interesting thing about the film festivals, and I get that, but also, you know, it's I'm not saying it's an easy thing to just say, oh yeah, this was kind of knackered by the pandemic, or, you know, as they say in the interview, that it's too downbeat, too negative, or not, it doesn't have enough happiness kind of going through it. And I think that I definitely think that probably was the case. You know, the back end of COVID, people wanted to see something that was a little bit more uplifting, and definitely wasn't as introspective as this film kind of can be. It can be read as, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I just wondered, yeah, like for you in terms of your relationship with them in a sort of production sense, and then having done your own film, and then obviously working with Jenks, I just wondered what you thought of their reflections on releasing a movie, making a movie in Cornwall, and then how do you sort of package that? Do you make it like, play on that ideal of Cornwall as a venue, and you're going to see lots of nice vistas and this kind of stuff, which there's a little bit of that, but it doesn't play on that in a postcardy kind of way. Or, is this more about actually building up a legacy and an infrastructure of Cornish film, not just in the production side, but in the exhibition side, and just focusing on that rather than really worrying about what wider interpretations are? Because I think that's quite difficult to do. You do want your films to play all over the place. So therefore, does it become regional and rural cinema? So it would play well in Scotland, or it would play well in the north of England, or wherever. Do you know what I mean? Sorry, it's a bit rambly, that question, but do you get what I'm saying? It's kind of, is this a completely different approach to sort of the film, both the film production side and the film distribution exhibition side from your perspective as a royal yaw? As a royal yaw.
Yeah. No, yeah. I think it makes sense. I'll try and unpack it as best as I've understood, but I think I know what you're sort of circling around, which I think is lots of things that we think about and talk about on the ground here in terms of the films that we engage with and work with, and because that part of the work of the lab is to work in innovative ways, to think about how micro budget and independent films are made and how we can impact that and sort of represent a different way of doing things in terms of what is the industry standard. And a lot of that aligns already with what Cornish filmmakers have done, for decades, which is find ways to make work and then release it however they can, because the world isn't really paying attention, and it's not just a Cornwall, it's Scotland, it's Wales, it is the Celtic nations, it is regional cinema, it's even, and I say this to students all the time, like, I've got students from Leeds, I've got when was the last time you saw a film from Leeds and you knew it was Leeds? Regional cinema doesn't really exist in the UK, and it's interesting with A Long Way Back, because almost one of its kind of spiritual cousins is something like Bill Forsyth, that kind of quiet, contemplative Scott. But those films we don't see, and there's probably loads being made, shorts or whatever, but it is that awareness which the exhibition is really important for in terms of showing that stuff. And I think until there's a concerted effort on the behalf of the central film industry, which is London still, in terms of not just supporting that work but in production, but supporting it in distribution, nothing will change. What's interesting down here is that filmmakers like the Harvey brothers, is they do have a desire to reach a wider audience. They want to be, their films are very mainstream in terms of, they're not like Jenks's films. They're very kind of, what might be called traditional narrative films. They have a desire to reach a wider audience and connect and but unlike other places, and I think that's a kind of quite a Cornish and regional thing, is that that's not going to stop them making work, because then they're used to not having that audience. Mark's work has shone a spotlight on Cornwall in a different way, but what I haven't seen is a kind of a flurry of people going, kind of locally trying to capitalize on that. Everyone's just kind of going about what they were doing before, because I think everyone's aware that Mark's a very singular voice, but also, people's idea of what this place is not going to be fulfilled by the kind of films that are going to come out of it. It's interesting you sort of say about the postcard stuff. Most of the postcard stuff in Long Way Back, which is different to Brown Willie, it's not as Cornwall, even though a lot of it was shot here. It's other parts of the country. A lot of Cornish filmmakers are, of course, interested in the landscape in different ways. And there is a tension here between that. Like Mark's talked about that a lot. The postcards and the village idiot. And the kind of the traditional idea of like rural coastal life on screen is a very narrow one. And a lot of filmmakers are trying to, which again I think is great for an ecosystem if it can be supported and it can be, something that is a going concern. But the reality is that people probably want stuff that looks nice and speaks to their idea of Cornwall if they're going to go to the cinema. That's the problem with regional cinemas historically is that the films that naturally emerge from those places are more in tension with the locale than the films that parachute in, and like use the seaside town and bring a whole production down and just want that kind of production aesthetic and then go back up country. So I don't know if that kind of speaks to what you were saying, but and again, and it just makes the kind of the release of the films, something where I think there is and I think what was interesting was I think I probably pushed for more tension in them in the interview, in terms of I would have thought that they would have been more disappointed, a bit more angry about that they seemed much more sanguine, which again speaks to a bit of like, well, they kind of know what to expect more than I did, because that's their experience much more than it is mine.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, my experience of being down there wasn't different from any other experience anywhere, which is people tend to want to keep a hold of what they've got on their own little patch. You know what I mean? And whether it's kind of, naming no names, any specifics, it's like if somebody's setting something up or running something, you know what I mean? They're going to do it in a way that keeps them in that in a certain position. So nobody wants to, with that mindset, very few people want to take chances. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's exacerbated in a rural area when you're fighting for crumbs. If it comes to funding. And you must. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I think Brett and Si were very diplomatic about some of the long-standing tensions down here around what is Cornish film and what makes a Cornish film and what is Cornish cinema. It's deep. We haven't got time for it now, but it is deeply political, and historical.
No,
yeah. And I think that is true of a lot of places.
Yeah, and also sort of representational as well, in terms of that sense of, we don't want, I mean, this is not Cornwall, is it? But like, we don't want sort of straw dogs.
Exactly.
But then
it is Cornwall. That is Cornwall. Yeah. That's the classic example.
Yeah, but then also, it's kind of like there's a group who are like, there'll be a faction who don't want that, but then there's a faction who don't want Poldark either, or a BBC sort of one show version either of Cornwall, because that speaks to that idea, I think, of the Tory second home, and the idea that David Cameron's down there and what have you, so
yeah.
But then again, I suppose as well, you've got to push back a little bit on, I mean, it's one of those things that I think sometimes is a little bit of a misnomer, and people are afraid to call out audiences, and sort of, I mean, they said, the audiences, once they've seen the film, they're happy to do the work. But I think, if you're showing an independent movie to a group who have come out to that specifically, they're happy to do the work. But I think we've gone through years, and this is not necessarily just London-centric film development in the UK's fault. It's just generally it's the culture of film engagement right now. It's streaming. It's the fact that we have so many channels, but yet we seem to be more cine literate back when there was only 3 channels. And it's the fact that the algorithm decides what we want, rather than a sort of a curation that has the educate, entertain, and inform. And it sounds like a cliche now, even sort of saying that, when the BBC is in so much trouble, it seems, right now. But I just think that audiences aren't prepared to do the work, even on a movie like this, which I don't think is particularly difficult, at all. It's just, the action moves on at a particular pace, with what you're talking about, and maybe that's part of it. It's just like, a huge percentage of audience are just ready. They think film is things that are fired at you at 100 mile an hour, so you never ever get bored. It's like film editing, like doom scrolling, essentially. And obviously this is not that.
Yeah, it's not that, and I think you're right. And anything that is like that almost has to have its arbiters of validation. So it has to be screened at the BFI or released by A24 or whatever it is. Like, there has to be these and I think you're right. I think because a lot of that is very quick signifiers of validity, and I think that's where I certainly find attention in terms of not just Long Way Back, but Long Way Back as an example of, you know, independent film. And that's where I think that the failure is not necessarily cinemas or London audience. You know, I think festivals have a huge part to play, particularly independent film festivals, which they have their own tensions, they have their own difficulties, funding, marketplace. I get all of that, but it's like, for me, the responsibility is for those to be testing grounds for stuff, and those are places to build an audience or to see, you know, and I think having been involved in a lot of films here that have gone out to the festival circuit and had a lot of feedback over a lot of stuff over recent years, a lot of it is that, you know, that festival programmers are kind of scared of films, that they don't know where to sit, or they don't think an audience will, like you say, kind of quickly come in and understand, you know. And that goes from shorts to docs to, you know, I think there is a real problem in independent film festivals that are not doing that work. So again, if it's been at Berlin, tick a box, great, you know. But there are thousands of festivals, and their programs all look very, very similar, because they're gravitating to the same films which are validated by British Council or BFI, or they've been at these festivals. So in terms of many, many festivals, the film programming that's actually out there is very, very limited. But there are thousands and thousands of films being made, and some of them are terrible, obviously, but some of them are not. And some of them, I think, deserve a chance to just have that run and see, you know. And that's what's shrinking for me. And then by the time, you know, the chances for people to actually see the work and get it is kind of limited. So, you know, not saying that I think Long Way Back should have been playing at XY festivals, but I think it's a film that deserved more of a go in that space, you know. And hopefully people will come to it now. And I think the thing is, having been in the room with it, with an audience, there is something that happens with an audience, you know. So you do want to see, and I think it's to go back to the thing you were saying about, like, well, who's it for? Is it just for Cornish people, or does it travel? And I think part of the thing with festivals, and I certainly found that with Wilderness, was the places that took a punt on it, you started to see, oh, okay, it plays in these spaces, you know. And that's where you realise audiences are smarter than, you know, and that's where you start to build an idea of what a film can do. And, you know, the question of, is it for Cornish audiences or is it for wider audiences, will only be answered by it playing for wider audiences and seeing. But we live in a risk-averse society, because, like you say, if it doesn't hit on the opening weekend and hit the algorithm and be in the top 10, it disappears forever, you know. And there's a lot at stake for people. I get that in a capitalist sense. I get that, you know. I get the pressures that people are under to make people come out to festivals and to sit in front of screens, but there's not much else out there.
But I mean, again, I don't know. Like, given the circumstances, you know, of what Brett and Si sort of talked about post-pandemic and a particular kind of festival season, because of that, you know, let's say that this came out in a normal year, we didn't have the pandemic, you know, counterfactual. You know, maybe there would have been a sort of broader run or a broader acceptance in festivals, and it may have got a broader run in cinemas in various areas, you know what I mean, that could speak to it in that sense. But, you know, maybe there's a realism that has to be kind of accepted, that it's not going to play in London, you know, but beyond maybe the odd screening here where there's a Q&A and that kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? It's not going to have a sort of run in London in that sense. So therefore, first of all, it's back to that question of what is the difference between cinema as commerce and cinema as art, and then secondly, what is the measure of success for a film like this? Given its context, and maybe this is, you know, it's streaming. It's had a run. It's been out. And now it's streaming, and you know, I mean, we're talking about it, but you know, we have a connection to the filmmakers. But if it might get picked up elsewhere, and it has a sort of long tail, for want of a better word, or a little bit of a, you know, a slow burn success in that sense, and that's kind of what you can expect in this day and age.
Yeah, no, and I think that's absolutely valid, and I don't want to speak for them, but I would imagine that they would see it as a success, that it's, you know, it's towards cinemas and they had good audiences and it's out available for people to buy. You know, I don't think they're naive enough to not think that that's a success, you know. I think one of the things, you know, like Wilderness benefited massively from coming out in 2021 when cinemas were closed.
Sure.
And, you know, and managed to get national press coverage alongside Palm Springs and Sound of Metal on the film review show, because everything was flattened. Everything came out at the same time in the same places. There was no. We massively benefited from that in terms of coverage, and that was successful. And I think that probably the thing that I didn't really talk about was where they are. I sort of talked about, asked them about where they are next, but I think if you look at that trajectory, this would be a success. And I don't think anyone down here has got ideas above their station. I think the reality of all the things you're talking about are absolutely prevalent there, and the hope is that the next one does a bit better. That's always the hope, I think. I think with this and with Ennis, and there's a documentary coming out later in the year that the lab supported. We should get a decent release, I think over the next couple of years there will be more work to start having more conversations about what is Cornish cinema now. That's not just Mark, So I think what's really great is that there is a release for this film. It is available, and there's a kind of legitimacy of that. They've got a distributor behind them in terms of that space, and the long tail is where I think that it will remain in some kind of conversation over the next couple of years until people are bored of Cornwall and start thinking about Guernsey cinema or whatever it is that will be next.
Yeah. yeah, that's it. It's funny, isn't it, how you've got to sort of take your turn.
Make the most of it.
Yeah, but it's funny, isn't it? Because there was the film, there was that film that has come out, and it's a sort of South London film. I forget what it's called now, but it's had a release, and it's just posters of it everywhere.
Is that Rye Lane, is it?
Yeah, that's the one. I had never heard of it until like 2 minutes, but it's like featured everywhere. It's got good reviews in national press, but it hits a. I mean, and I don't think it's out of turn to sort of say there's always a zeitgeist. It's obvious, I think, what Rye Lane's zeitgeist is, whereas something like Long Way Back may be considered, this is just, for want of a better word, sort of white people problems out in the sticks kind of thing. Do you know?
I know what you mean, but also
is that? I mean, maybe I'm not trying to say that. I'm just being sort of playing devil's advocate.
No, but how I would extend that is I think that, and A Long Way Back and Wilderness are quite similar in that, is that they're dramas with no conceivable commercial genre, and there's no stars in them. And formally they are. Yeah. So they're not horror movies, they're not comedies, they're not musicals, which I think Rye Lane's a musical. They have no genre hook. I mean, Long Way Back's a road movie, but they're very rarely commercial. But there's nobody in them. There's no hook, and they are, so the hooks are much more subtle. They're much more for people that might know road movies, or in the case of Wilderness might know John Cassavetes, which are, you just have to, I think the thing is you just have to know that the reasons for making the work have to exist outside of making a profit, because there's unless you can get people in it, or you can get a hook that like a horror movie, like it's really hard. It's really hard. So it can't be the driving force, and I don't think it is. Certainly not for the films that we make down here. It is a nice bonus, when those films can travel, and that audiences get the opportunity to engage, even if the reality of getting to do so is really, really hard work.
Yeah, great. Well, really good interview. Some really interesting sort of subject matter as well, and the film's available. Just on basically everything,
everything.
Yeah.
All the usual suspects.
All the usual suspects. Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Dario. That was a really interesting conversation. We've not really covered that material before in terms of
No.
So I'm really pleased to be able to sort of dig into a bit of that stuff. So yeah, thanks for your thoughts and questions on that, and thanks to Si and Brett for their time. And the film is available and is well worth a watch for sure. There's no bonus this time for our Patreon subscribers because Dario recorded. How would you describe it, Dario? A stream of consciousness double bill.
Yeah, just one of my rambles coming in and out of film screenings, which is kind of interesting. I don't know. It seems to satisfy an itch that I don't have the time to sort of sit down and I'm not a film reviewer, and I don't like that sort of the tying of that format. So just being able to sort of use my phone now and tape, and the audio quality is pretty decent. And it fits in with some of the things that I've done. I'm still not happy with how rambly I am, so I have to kind of have cues and a little bit of a shape there. But interesting to see those two films back to back.
Yeah, I bet. So he talked about Babylon and Heat, so like a 3-day double bill or whatever it was that he was in the cinema for.
Yeah,
and
6 hours 40 or something.
You absolute masochist. But yeah, an interesting. So if you are a Patreon subscriber, well worth a listen. And what I like about it, I like listening to you thinking, and it's very different to this. It's much freer, and I think it is a nice accompaniment to the main episodes. And I've got a couple of ideas of things I'd like to do, sort of solo bonusy stuff that have come out of just engaging with yours, which I think are really, really fascinating. But I did want to mention something before we close, which was you said that you sort of outed me as a kind of Whiplash fan, which I'm not too happy about. I'll tell you why. Well,
okay,
I do like Whiplash as a movie. But it is a victim of what we might call film student bro.
Oh,
love,
okay, fine.
So
I haven't had any Whiplash, so I didn't really know that.
We get it all the time. Like literally, I cannot do an interview without it coming up. Really, for an applicant who loves Whiplash and Damien Chazelle in general, they love La La Land as well. And I've been reflecting on this since you said that. Because I do like. I haven't seen it since it came out, but what I liked about it was a film where the filmmaker's thesis was this is a way to genius. This kind of harsh, which you sort of brought up in your bonus, the genius is brought out by this kind of sadistic approach. And I think the film is definitely saying that. But what I like about Whiplash, which I always felt, was that it didn't come down on whether that was a good or a bad thing. I think that there's enough in Miles Teller's performance, particularly at the end, where the question of is this worth it hangs in the air. Yeah. In terms of like the film has presenting an idea and is not closing down on it. What I find really interesting is that every film since that I've seen of Chazelle's, and I haven't seen Babylon, does not have that ambiguity. It's so forceful in terms of this is my idea and this is what I'm thinking, this is what I want you to think. And I think that over time, what I like about Whiplash is more of a promise. And technically, I think it's a really well-made film, but I like the idea of, okay, this is a filmmaker who's going to present these really difficult things, but not close it off as to where they sit on it. And everything's closed since. So, yeah.
Well, Babylon isn't.
Okay, interesting.
So, I mean, if you can, deal with the length and the fact that, but it goes the other way where it's kind of like you're not really sure at all what's going on in terms of a
well, that might be too far the other way then, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I mean? And I think, don't get me wrong, I think Whiplash is actually quite that's part of its issue, isn't it, though? It's a really engaging film.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean? And there is a sort of sense underneath that, actually, am I sort of enjoying too much this process of abuse, essentially,
Yeah. And it because I think that's it's all in the performance, isn't it? J.K. Simmons is so powerful. Yeah, and that's what I kind of like about it, is that sort of ambiguity. But yeah, I just wanted it on the record that, for anybody listening to the bonus, I'm not it's not without thought, but also that it's shifted because, like a lot of filmmakers, it's become something I have to deal with on a daily basis. But also,
you still need to watch The Eddie.
I do need to watch The Eddie. Yeah, I do need to watch The Eddie. And listening to your bonus made me think, that needs to go back on the list. So I'm always interested in what he's doing. And there was bits of First Man which I really liked. Although I just didn't think it held together as a single thing. But hopefully that will be enough to get people to plug in to the bonus before we return in a few weeks with another episode where there will be another bonus. And in the meantime, we will have our monthly newsletter, which will be going out around the end of the month.
Cool. Yeah, looking forward to it all. I'll get back on my editing bay straight away.
Back to work, whiplash style, cracking the whip.
Yes. Get on with it.
Right. So yeah, let's wrap it up there. Thank you everyone for listening. Thanks Dario for your contributions. Thanks to our guests, and we will catch you again. This has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.